Many of you will know that I was in Austin this week. I went to do what may be the first in history emergency podcast with Joe Rogan, who put me and Dr. Pierre Corey on to discuss the situation of YouTube, Google censorship and repurposed drugs. It's an excellent piece. It's gotten a very positive reaction. I strongly recommend you look it up. I also went on Lex Fridman's wonderful show, and I must say Lex and I had never met before, but Lex is a marvelous, fascinating, and very unusual human being. I really thoroughly enjoyed meeting him, and I hope that there are many more discussions to come. But I want to point your attention to one thing in particular. In my discussion with Lex, and as on this show, I don't think Lex really does interviews. He does discussions with people, but Lex is so fascinating that obviously they're all peer conversations. He asked me a question that caught me off guard, but it put something together that I hadn't realized before. Lex asked me if I was aware that martyrdom was a kind of drug that people could get addicted to. And it was clear that he wanted to know whether or not that was in some way motivating us to challenge power as held at Google YouTube. And it immediately struck me that this must be something that people are thinking. Now, I don't think there is anything to this idea, but as I said to Lex, we are all mysteries to ourselves, and it is always possible that there's something happening outside the view of our conscious mind that is driving, that we are unaware of. But in this case, I believe something else is true, and I want to tell you a little bit. The question was so good that I couldn't help but keep thinking about it on the plane home and in the days since, and I've come to a conclusion about what role this analysis is playing and what the analysis that I think is correct might be. So there's a big difference to me, and I would argue inherently, between people who seek martyrdom and people who are willing to risk things in the pursuit of important goals. These may superficially look alike, but they're two opposite things. It's a little bit like fission and fusion power, which you can say are both nuclear power, but really they are literally opposite processes. The desire for martyrdom is, in my opinion, a selfish process. It is comes out of a need in the person, whereas the willingness to take risks in order to achieve something is more or less the opposite. It is, in some sense, selfless. Now, I don't want to say that we or I are selfless. Obviously, human beings are complicated, and we all get something out of what we do, or we wouldn't do it. But in terms of what is driving us, I believe something that is not entirely visible is playing out. In order to see it, I need to point us to a discussion, an ongoing discussion that has been taking place largely between me and Jordan Peterson over the course of many years now, or several years at least. And it has to do with the meaning of myth. I think Jordan and I both believe that myth is evolved and very important. In other words, it's an adaptation and therefore has to be treated very seriously, and we dispense with it at our peril. My point to Jordan has been that because all of our myths evolved in a world we no longer live in, we have to look at them with a certain amount of circumspection. We have to reevaluate them because they may or may not be applicable to our current situation. And I think Jordan takes them to be likely to be much more important as they were presented. Now, leave that conversation where it is. I want to revisit a number of myths, really two of them in particular that I think are relevant to our current situation. One of them is the myth of David and Goliath, and the other is the allegory of the cave. Now, the allegory of the cave is presented as a myth. It's not presented as a modern story or as a literal story. And these, in some sense, are opposing myths. David kills Goliath. The person who leaves the cave in Plato's allegory is killed by those who don't want to understand that the real world is outside the cave and is not contained in the shadows on the wall. So we should take that in some sense as a tension. We are trying not to find ourselves in the position that Plato describes, and we are trying to find ourselves in David's role. But in order to understand how this myth emerged and what it means to us, I think we actually have to look at the story of David and Goliath and see what it is. Now, if you dig into this, you will discover that historians actually believe that Goliath was a real person, and we'll return to him in a second. David was also a real person, but David did not kill Goliath. Apparently, Goliath was actually killed by a person named Elhanan. The story was then subsumed into David's story effectively by the authors of biblical texts and the evolutionary process that followed from their original authorship. In effect, it's like a screenwriter compositing multiple characters into one to simplify a story so that it can fit into 2 hours of a movie. So Elhanan fights Goliath and wins. And what are we to take from this? Well, the other part of the David and Goliath story, the part that does not involve Elhanan and David, involves Goliath himself, who in all probability was a real giant. Now, what does it mean to be a real giant? Well, those of us who have looked at the Guinness Book of World Records and the Book of Lists and seen other such discussions know that every so often nature produces a very large person. Now, what is typically going on in the case of these very large people is that they have a pituitary tumor. That pituitary tumor does not shut down the production of growth hormone at the point that it should, and so the person continues growing beyond the normal point of growth cessation. Now, that has a number of impacts. Those of you who have been following DarkHorse, who have listened in on the portal, will be aware that if you are accelerating growth past the normal point of cessation, that you will be borrowing from the capacity of repair and maintenance. And that means that giants may be very powerful, but they are also fragile. And that is in all probability the deepest message of the David and Goliath story, or better, the Elhanan and Goliath story. So, what does this have to do with Lex Fridman's question? It has to do this. I am not interested in martyrdom. As I told Lex, I'm enjoying what we are doing, and I feel that it is far too important to have it come to an end by fighting an unfightable foe. I know I speak for you as well in this regard, Heather. You don't have a desire to die on that hill. But what people don't necessarily realize is that dying on that hill is not the only option. There is dying on that hill. We have no desire for it. There is also taking that hill, and we do have a desire to do that. Why in this case? Because that hill has to be taken. What Google and YouTube are doing is they are infantilizing a huge fraction of the population. They are making certain discussions off limits. We are only able to discuss the COVID situation if we adhere to certain pre-digested conclusions, and we pretend that they emerge from evidence, which they do not. The evidence is conflicting and self-contradictory. What that demands is an analysis that we are literally not allowed to do on YouTube at this moment. We have to end YouTube's hegemony. Either YouTube has to relent and it has to allow that conversation, or we have to recognize that YouTube is effectively like Sesame Street now, where it's going to tell us things that it believes to be in our interest and expect us to just simply take them in and not question them. That is obviously an untenable situation. DarkHorse is not a program for children. This is a program for adults who are interested in nuance. It cannot exist on a platform like YouTube if YouTube is going to exert pressure of this form. We have to take this hill. Now, I do not believe that DarkHorse alone can fight Google. That's very unlikely. But I would point out, to the extent that the myth of Elhanan and Goliath, which becomes the myth of David and Goliath, emerged from an actual historical story, the population of planet Earth when that story took place was less than 1% the population that we have now. Goliath is not likely to be a person. David, or Elhanan, is not likely to be a person either. These are liable to be conglomerations. Google is playing the role of Goliath. That is what it has chosen to do. I hope that it is free enough to unchoose that, but we'll find out. David is not going to be a person. David is going to emerge. People who are courageous enough and see the picture clearly enough are going to join together, and they are going to fight this battle. Some of you may have seen Bill Maher last night on his program discussing the predicament of our channel. It is well worth considering how David or Elhanan is going to form as a matter of emergence and figuring out how one can participate in that. For our part, we are going to have to escape this infantilizing discussion of crucial life and death medical issues that we are seeing unfold on YouTube and on the other major platforms. They have effectively created the Truman faux medical show, and it is intolerable. It's going to kill many, many people if we are not careful. What can we do? Well, the sword of Damocles continues to hang over the DarkHorse. You can see our installation here to demonstrate that jeopardy. And what we are going to have you do is we are going to have you move over to our new home on Odyssey. And I want you to realize that this is both a practical matter. This is a place that we can continue to broadcast no matter what YouTube, Google does. But it is also symbolic. The reason that platforms like Google and YouTube continue to exist, even though people find the censorship they are exerting intolerable, has to do with something called network effects. Network effects mean that once you've got the audience, people have a very hard time figuring out how to leave. Of course, you can leave and you can go broadcast somewhere else, but if the audience isn't there, what's the point? So what we're going to do is we are going to move our audience to Odyssey. We are not giving up our spot on YouTube, and hopefully YouTube will realize the gigantic error that it is making, and it will realize that actually DarkHorse is meant something as a warning, right? The podcast is named DarkHorse because the dark horse is an entity that is mysterious. One does not know how to bet on it. How would you bet in a fight between people like us and Google, YouTube? Well, simplest thing to do is just to bet against us because, of course, Google is huge and we are not. On the other hand, the story of Elhanan and Goliath tells you something else. It tells you that Goliath, though incredibly powerful, is not invulnerable. That is what Elhanan figured out, was that this giant was fragile and that there was a way to attack him. Now, I believe if you followed the story so far, you will understand that because the new Goliath is an emergent property, it is evolved. And that tells us something about its vulnerabilities. It tells us it will be ferociously powerful on territory that it understands well, and it will be a bit dim on territory it's never seen before. That's the nature of evolved creatures, humans being the lone exception to this pattern. Creatures do not deal with novelty well. Goliath does not deal with novelty well, and that is what Goliath is now scratching his head over. What the hell is happening in his attempt to shut down this discussion from DarkHorse and elsewhere? And Google is going to find out. So with that, let me ask you, if you are not already watching this on Odyssey, to find the link in the YouTube description that will tell you how to get to our Odyssey page and move there now, and we will start the podcast as normal.